I'm here, in fact, to invite you in. If we're doing tropes, I will do tropes on a journey. I hope you will follow me on what has been the questions that I'm talking to you here today about. Really come from a combination of two different sets of research that I do. That it sort of took me a while to realize I could bridge them. So I started out in grad school, and this is if the undergraduates are back, studying the history of Central America in the Age of Revolution. So Atlantic history, the connections between Europe, Africa, the Americas. And separately, as soon as I finished my PhD, did a summer NEH seminar with Jim Ackerman at the Newberry Library on popular cartography, where I was introduced to several wonderful folks doing the history of cartography and started looking at maps and travel accounts. And it took me a long time to circle back and ask myself about, since I was looking at maps and travel, what about maps and travel in Latin America? Why can't I bring those two things together? And when I did, I realized there is this vision that we have of especially South America and the Caribbean that is a vision, and this is where I'm going to shock you again and bring you into the 20th century. I apologize to those of you who would like to stop in 1750, but really the vision we have of Spanish America, South America, is a coastal vision. And so these are some images that I'm showing you up front because we have 20 minutes, and this is where I might end the talk. But both pedagogically and as a form of inoculation, I want to show you a couple of things to start us out. And they range from a fabulous board game to travel accounts and a map prepared, as you'll see if you look at the exhibit, for a cruise line before a trip that sort of brings certain tropes of going around the Americas to the 19th and 20th century viewers. So I want you just sort of to take these in because these will help in two ways. Julie Andrews says start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I'm starting at the end because, as I said, pedagogically, this gives you something to think about as I'm walking you through the earlier examples. And if I don't make it all the way through the slides, you will have nonetheless seen them and know where my route is supposed to end. Not all journeys get where they're going. We have pirates on the way. So today, if all goes well, I'm going to be talking to you about where these tropes of South America as a place to go around or eventually across, but still mostly around, comes from where that, for me, first iconic map that shows the route and sets the stage and pulls things together. And then we're going to be going, I am sure, at a breakneck pace through the 17th and 18th century core examples that sort of repeat the tropes and begin to bring them into public consciousness as we then kind of come into echoes and reflections in the 19th century and conclude on the thought that there is more to meet the eye. So really where some people are looking at a collection of maps that are really one author or one kind of map or one moment in map history, I'm not going to be digging into these case studies about the places, but really using the place of South America as a way to understand how we think about movement and maps and movement and people's movements on maps and how those are sort of tied to questions of empire. So the antecedents, the very good place to start. Travel accounts people have been writing for a long time. Maps and travel accounts go together. If I ever finish my book, you will know how I really think about that. But in terms of Spanish America, or what we think of as Spanish America, there are certain views of the Americas that came into the European public consciousness as soon as the Europeans got to the Americas. And for those of you who study map history, the De Insulis Nuper in Mare Indico is Columbus's letter, the Basel edition, which folks in the room have written quite a bit about, shows that first view of America as a series of islands. It is a view that is a woodcut that went into one of multiple editions that went raging around Western Europe. It's the copy that had the map, so more of them survive than the other editions. And it shows a map, if you will, or an illustration of the world, of the Americas as a world, as a set of islands, based on absolutely no empirical evidence whatsoever. It's an illustrator's view. The illustrator never saw the space. So there's this sense of islands from the very beginning. There's the sense of islands in the second view that most people saw in the publication of Hernan Cortes's second letter, the letter where he broke the Spanish laws and went and conquered the Aztec Empire. Barbara Mundy has written extensively, as has Elizabeth Boone, about the map of Tenochtitlan. And here I want to just draw your attention very quickly. It's a city. It's a composite image that has both Mexica and European traits to it. And most of the work that's been done has been done focusing on the city of Tenochtitlan and trying to decipher what it means. But as Elizabeth Boone points out, that map on the other side, the probably really European map of the Gulf of Mexico, not in scale, not meant to be in scale, says there's this, again, a focus on getting around a city, an island city, and getting around the coast. The third map, again, from the third account, manuscript, not circulated in print immediately, Anton Pigafett's manuscript account of the Magellanic circumnavigation of the globe, which shows for the first time the straits that we now know as the Straits of Magellan, which emerges from the tradition of isolarios or island books. These are very quickly 3 maps that focus on the space that was encountered, that use the best cartographic tools of their day to say this is where we went and what we saw. What's notably absent is what's going to come next. So again, really focused on the space of the world. Equally at this time, if you were a sailor, what you would be looking at, as we've already seen, are maritime charts. And there's a visual vocabulary to these charts of the ocean world. Here is an example of a very elegant, one that would not, as we've heard already on ships, have been taken, elegant illustrated Portolan chart from 16th century Spain. As we're thinking Portolan for the purpose of your eyes for the rest of this presentation, what will draw our attention are the rum lines, the lines that permitted a sailor to plot a course and navigate, and equally the relationship of land and sea. Here, this is a map focused on the shorelines. It is not a map focused on the geography or the topography of the interior. It's illustrated in the interior. What they want you to see is the list of places around the shore that a sailor would have used to orient himself on travel. So this is traditional to Portolan maps, but you will see, or Portolan charts for navigation, but that emphasis on the shoreline and naming places along the shore is something that you just want to think about. And the relationship of the text, what's horizontal, what's vertical, its relationship to the viewer and its relationship to the space. Second set of views that one might have for sailors is that popularized by Lucas Jans Wagenauer in the 16th century, the mirror of the world. I will not butcher the Dutch for you. Here we have a view of the world for sailors that takes coastal profiles, the view you might have if you were at a ship, seated a little bit away from shore, looking straight in front of you. You want to know what that coastline looks like so you know where you are, so you sail close where there are no rocks and you don't crash. And then the more bird's eye view that gives you a sense of the water and the approach to land. These two sets of views are going to be repeated, this in the treasure of the sea, for actually taking with you. This might be what a sailor himself would be looking at, trying to navigate with sailing directions. And the third piece here is the pricked line. From an English translation of Wagenauer, it's commendable every 24 hours to prick your card, the English of chart, once and set down how much you have sailed and made. So sailors every day would take their measurement where they were, mark one prick on the line, and continue their navigation. Here at sea, you needed not to know only what was there in front of you, the destination, but how to get there, how to move through space, and how to track your own movement through space. In other words, if you will, an itinerary if you were on a road. And so the piece that we're going to add to this story as we move forward is getting that route on the map. It was not self-evident to Columbus, to Cortes, to the others, that their route had to be on the map. So getting the route on the map is an innovation in this period. It starts early in the 16th century. There are examples. There are always examples before you think there are examples. But one of the earliest ones that was popularized and distributed is this one by Battista Agnesi, who compiled manuscript Portolan atlases. And this world map that appears in many of them notably has a map with a route. And that route is not in the form of a pricked line. And what you'll see, does anybody know what that is what Pigafetta did not put on the map. Here we have Magellan's circumnavigation brought to the world attention. And what is harder to see, and what I didn't see the first time I looked at the map, is there's a second route in gold, so it doesn't show up quite as much, and it isn't in all the copies. And there you have in gold the route of the gold and silver working their way back to Europe. So you have the individual journey and you have the imperial journey. Both of these on the map, and they're setting the story, they're setting the stage for bringing that route into the travel account, and into the travel account that shows Spanish America as a place to go around and as a place to extract. Right? Both of those stories are here in this Agnese map from the get-go. So, how does that work its way into travel, and where do we go with this? The ideas that I've just talked us through, the outline map of the world, are going to show up in Spanish histories, like Antonio Herrera y Tordesillas, where the map, it doesn't say, hi, I'm a Portolan chart. The rum lines are missing. But now that you know to look for that empty space and look for the coastline, you say, wait a minute, there's a little bit of geography here, but that's also kind of a coastal view of the world. You look at the description of America in 1638. And again, it says a geographic card of America, South America, which must be inserted on the next page. There's directions to the printer right there on the front of the page. Where do you put the map? And this is a map rotated sideways, and it calls itself a geographic map. But notice where the geographic detail is, where's invented material, and where all those place names are going up and down the coasts. So geographic, yes, but that coastal vision is there even on the land maps. And the description in the world, again, is in the text, is a description of how to travel around within. So a description, sometimes the sea is there on land if you know where to look. And if you look again at a fairly well-known map of the peoples and the places of Spanish America, or America and its new table, you'll see again, not only is the coastline where a lot of the details showing up, but the places on the map are the forts, the islands, the ports that they would have been emerging from the folks reporting back from their sea travels. With the exception of Mexico City, Cusco, and Potosi, the three inland places that are repeatedly mapped over and over, often copying the same image throughout the colonial period, when you start paying attention, realizing that almost all of Europe's views are seaborne views, whether those are from Spanish America, from folks in the region bringing it back, or folks from the outside who have a hard time getting in, the English and the French, who I'll be talking about in a minute. The coastline is the vision. There is not a landscape painting tradition in Spanish America as there is in the Netherlands. There is a religious painting tradition, and if you look, as I started to look, as I was thinking, well, what had Europeans seen of the Americas up until the 18th century? We're comfortable moving back and forth and comparing photographs to early manuscript documents. When you start looking for representations of the land and the landscape, they are notably few, except when you look on the map. So taking this seaborne view, looking around the edges, we're going back to a map in a way that we've already seen. Carla Loy used it to show the invisible places. Sir Francis Drake, privateer, English, sailed twice to the New World and put it on the map. The originals are non-extant, but the famous West Indian voyage that he made with a fleet was embargoed by his queen, much as the Spanish had embargoed publication of their knowledge of the routes and routes and roads to the Indies. This map that appeared in both a 1588 and 1589, accompanying a 1589 edition of his travels, was not published by the man himself. Wow, that was 15? Wow. All right. You will note that the map, that the route appears, and you will note that the other images, there are 4 other place maps of events, the attacks, the predations he did on 4 ports across the Atlantic. This earlier trip was published in a later edition 50 years later. Again, the route map is going to take him around the world, and here he's going to be combining the views of a reception, a magnificent reception by the king of the Moluccas, and saving by God of the ship. So you have a story of heroism, a story of the grace of God, a story of imperial grandeur, and this vision of the routes and the routes are going to continue over the centuries. In the 17th century, what happens, you'll see examples from 5 different authors, Ringrose and Dampier, pirates went around South America. Feuillet and Fraisier, scientific scientists sent by the King of France to map what they couldn't come inland and see. Le Condamine, a French scientist, technically going inland, but you'll see that the vision that we get over and over from the original maps taken and adapted from the Spanish captured by them, reprinted in Ringrose's Buccaneers of America. Dampier decides, well, it's not enough to show the route. He is published by Herman Mall, and one of his travels around the world, as some folks know, is inspiration for people thinking even fictionally, the global imaginary from Gulliver. But his route around the Bay of Panama is sort of one of the things I want to draw attention to. Dampier is arguing that his route, he's not just copying the Spanish, he's done multiple traverses, his multiple back and forth in the bay are what we should be paying attention to. And his vision of the Bay of Panama is rotated a little bit from the one that appeared in Ringrose, who he's competing with. This is a competitive map. It's not just I went there, but I did it myself. I'm original. I didn't just copy the view that was in the atlas that we stole. And his is the one that carries the day. So the Dampier vision of the Isthmus of Panama is going to appear in multiple versions, multiple maps in the 17th century, and that view is the view that came from the sea. So if you didn't know that this was Dampier's traverse of the coast that he was putting into a land map, you wouldn't know that this had an origin as a seaborne empire. Feuillet and Fraisier, as I said, 2 Frenchmen, their views similar but different. Feuillet is really going to emphasize in his route map that he is measuring every day. You can note the little dots that indicate where, day by day, they were taking their readings. There's a scientific accuracy about the route and how they took it. Fraisier, on the other hand, is much more interested in sharing not only his route, but really his understanding of the science of navigation. And his map is going to travel with the original plates into the English edition, and folks are really going to be interested in the science that he's doing. The coastal vision continues, including through the Spaniards Juan and Ulloa. In these travel accounts, the route is not only on the map, it is in the coastal profiles and views, which continue from seaboard, the precious moment when you do get the text telling you, I returned on board and spent the rest of the day drawing a city view. They're going to be combining these views that we saw early, and those views are even going to influence people like La Condamine when they start mapping the mountains of the interiors. Mapping the profile from sea to shore, there's kind of an argument that gets made from beginning to middle to end that replaces and replicates the particular perspectives. Through the 19th century, these perspectives, a sea captain's wife and widow, are going to show up in travel accounts. They're going to get more and more specific and specific until they finally get into yachtsmen. And here's the point about going around. We see what we want to see. Americans go to Cuba, what do we see? We see those. look what's also on the road. Have you ever seen a picture of those? No, of course not. So even as people are allowed onto land, are allowed to travel, are allowed to get in, what they're going to do is replicate and repeat and connect to the stories, to the back and forth, to these tropes that emerge as round trips, that emerge as putting peoples on the map, that emerge from the sea time perspectives. And South America, in this map, now that you've seen it, is the only place in the world where the dots don't go inland. Where people are sightseeing in South America, they don't seem to get past the shore. And as the photographs come in, as the airlines come in, as the cruise ships come in, these tropes are going to continue. They're going to continue that imperial narrative, and they're going to show more than the routes and the stages. They're going to show those individual stories. They're going to force a frame of reference that's about the edges and not the interiors. And they're going to make these legacies both visible and invisible in the way that the stories get told. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Lambert, and from the University of Warwick. And his paper is entitled Imaginary Africa, Armchair Geographers, Romantic Writers, and the Vision of the Dark Continent.
Thank you, Giorgio. Again, I'd like to add my thanks to all the people who played this, putting together this wonderful event. Oops. Right. Getting ahead of ourselves. So what I've come to realize, having the advantage of speaking towards the end of the conference, is that we've obviously been discussing consumption and about the consumption of maps and how difficult it is to track the consumption of maps. And in a sense, that's what this paper is entirely. It's a study of the consumption of a map. So what I want to do is I want to talk about an encounter between a map produced by the Scottish armchair geographer James McQueen from 1826, and the writings and the imaginings of the young Bronte siblings, Branwell, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. Now, before I turn to that, the context for this study then is a particular period of time from the 1780s to the 1830s, and I would want to characterize that period of time in terms of three overlapping contexts, which is kind of important to understand the sort of the nature of the encounter that's going on here. So we can talk first of all about the Romantic period. We could think about this as a artistic, literary, aesthetic, poetic period of time. And the Brontes were deeply influenced by the writing of Sir Walter Scott and the Romantics more broadly. Charlotte Bronte corresponded with Robert Southey, sending him some examples of early poetry. And although the Brontes, the sisters' work was published in the 1840s, the novels for which they're most famous, and therefore strictly by definitions, I guess, falls outside the Romantic period, they are quite clearly Romantic artists. And then secondly, we can think about the what historians call the Age of Abolition. So that period that characterizes the rise of a specific kind of social movement concerned with the British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and involvement in slavery, and the efforts that social movement undertook to end that involvement. And that period of the so-called Age of Abolition was also characterized by key moments that can be seen to both instantiate and also drive on that moment, that process, that political process. So we could think about the Abolition Act of 1807 or the Emancipation Act of 1833, or we could think about things like the Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica of 1831-32. And then thirdly, we could think about, this is a slow response. Okay, and thirdly, we could think about what Philip Curtin famously called the classical age of West African exploration. So what he was describing here was that period of mainly British and French efforts to open up the West African region for commercial, scientific, and humanitarian purposes. And during this period, the kind of key question that fires these exploratory activities is the so-called Niger problem. Where does this river go? Where does it start? Which way does it flow? What course does it take? And where does it end? And one of the key kind of early figures European figures in the effort to solve the Niger problem is the Scottish explorer Mungo Park, who, engaged by the African Association, undertakes his first journey into West Africa, into the Senegambian region between 1795 and 1797, and is the first European to bring back evidence that the Niger flows in the direction we know it to flow in. And one of the products famously of Park's efforts is a map produced by the English cartographer and surveyor James Rennell, which, based on Park's account, produces a kind of vision of West Africa that looks like this. And this contains some features that will be familiar to people. Kind of most importantly is that mountain range, and the fact that this prevents the Niger from going here. It's blocked by the mountains of Kong. So these three overlapping contexts then, the Romantic period, the Age of Abolition, and the Classical Age of West African exploration, were not only overlapping, they were also entangled. So accounts produced by travellers and explorers in West Africa, Mungo Park especially, were deeply influential on a generation of Romantic writers and poets. Secondly, Romantic writers and poets played an important role in producing new ideas about the African subject, which essentially kind of an articulation of notions of noble savagery, which played a significant role within in kind of setting the cultural groundwork for abolition. Of course, they also produced a whole series of other kind of racist stereotypes. And then thirdly, the whole project of African exploration was of interest to both opponents and supporters of slave trading and slavery. So the African Association, which sponsored Park, was founded in 1788. It was swallowed up by the Royal Geographical Society in London in 1831, and it had amongst its members both supporters of abolition and slave traders and merchants who were, and indeed slave owners. And many of the kind of rather muddled ambitions of the African Association reflect that. Now, these entanglements played out in West Africa. We see in this period increased European presence, partly driven by commercial motives, including those associated with new economic opportunities like the palm oil trade. But we also see the expansion of more formal administrative and military presence, not least from the 1810s, as Britain began to adopt a more interventionist policy regarding the suppression of the slave trade. European commercial and colonial interests prompted and were facilitated by exploratory activities. And indeed, these increasing European entanglements in West Africa also led to military conflict. The First Anglo-Asante War from 1823 to 1831, just to give perhaps the most significant example in this period. But these entanglements also played out on the page. The lively periodical genre of the time, the Quarterly Review, the Edinburgh Review, and specifically for my purposes, Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, which was a kind of Tory counter to the Edinburgh Review, carried detailed accounts about the process of West African exploration, debates around slavery and abolition, and so on. And it's via Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine that the young Brontes would be exposed to this kind of world. And we know that the Brontes had access to back copies of Blackwood's via one of their father's parishioners. They didn't have copies of the others, but Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, they read. Now, in the midst of these overlapping and entangled contexts, the substantive focus of the paper is essentially the production of this map and then the wider world that it spoke to. So this is a map produced by the brother Bramwell in 1830, and it is inspired directly by a map produced by the Scottish armchair explorer James McQueen from 1826. And I'm also interested in, and in the paper I discuss, the kind of wider influence of a kind of McQueen's cartographic imaginary on the young Brontes. Now, this map was intended to illustrate what Bronte scholars call the Glasstown and Angria saga, which was a highly intertextual, multi-genre series of works that the three sisters and brothers produced, made up of poems, articles, plays, speeches, short stories, novelettes, and so on, from the 1820s, from the late 1820s to the 1840s. And these various works describe the colonial efforts of a group called the Young Men, who were based on real historical figures. Wellington features as one of the young men. And they essentially voyaged to West Africa and established a series of settlements in West Africa. They battled the ferocious Ashanti throughout this period. And crucially, they establish the first settlement they established is this is the Glasstown Federation. And this is the capital here, Glasstown, or they also describe it as Vidopolis. And throughout the work, the four siblings are working together, and they're constantly rewriting and going back. It's not like there's a linear story. There's a kind of constant reimagining of this world. Now, the leading Bronte scholar, Christine Alexander, has drawn attention to the influence of this map, and specifically this map, in her writings on the Bronte's juvenilia, and has some very interesting things to say about the influence of, or rather the importance of this imaginary Africa on the young Brontes. So just to give you a taste, she says, the concept of Africa had a liberating effect on the minds of these young writers and allowed them to explore ideas and values alien to their cultural context. So there's a kind of the idea of this sort of liberates their artistic imaginary. Yet while Bronte scholars are certainly aware of the link to James McQueen, understandably their focus has been on tracing the story forwards. So in what role does this juvenilia play within the formation of their later poetic and literary works, tracing themes into, Jane Eyre or Tenant of Wildfell Hall, etc., etc. And what I want to do, in a sense, is trace the story back, because there's a lot more going on in this map than I think has been realised. So the map was actually one of a series of maps made by McQueen. We have evidence of an early one from 1816. The first that we still have a copy of is this. This is a map dated 1820, published in an 1821 book, the first book that James McQueen wrote about West Africa, entitled A Geographical and Commercial View of Northern Central Africa. Other maps produced by McQueen, including that of 1826, were published in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine. And over the next decade, these would McQueen would use these to accompany a series of articles about African geography. And this was in addition to a wider series of writing on slavery primarily, and also newspaper editorials in the equally Tory Glasgow Courier. So what can we say about the 1826 map? In terms of this 1820 map again, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on here, but the most important thing for our purposes of this is the Niger. There's the Niger Delta. And likewise, the map from 1826, a lot of the mountains have disappeared. There's the Niger. There's the Niger Delta. So, what can we say about this map? The first thing, that this was a thoroughly contested map. It was a representation of McQueen's specific claim about the central puzzle of the classic age of West African exploration. In other words, it was an argument about the course and termination of the River Niger. And while McQueen's Atlantic termination in what we, of course, now call the Niger Delta is correct, if you want to put it that way, accurate, there were many other theories in circulation at the time, some of which were deemed to be far more credible than this claim. And in fact, one of the interesting things about this map is its intertextuality, in that it actually portrays an alternate theory. So we have here this double dotted line, which shows course of the Niger according to the Quarterly Review. And of course, this is the kind of fitting into the argument about this is the western course of the Nile. So we have this actually joining up with the Nile. So it's the kind of that long-standing argument. Now, the other reference here to the Quarterly Review, which also printed articles and maps on West African geography, the Quarterly Review crucially was used by Sir James Barrow, who was the very high-ranking official within the British Admiralty, and effectively was the lead coordinator of British exploratory activity in this period, not only in Africa but also in the polar regions. And Barrow used the Quarterly Review, used anonymity in the Quarterly Review, effectively to use it as the kind of the official mouthpiece for British exploratory activity, sort of seeking to promulgate certain theories and essentially wins public support for this kind of exploratory work. And Barrow continually rejected McQueen's claims. Moreover, it wasn't just the content of McQueen's claims that were contested, but also his methods. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but McQueen never went anywhere near Africa. He did have the opportunity later in life, but didn't take it up. He was, in other words, an armchair geographer, about which we've heard, people have discussed that today. And he essentially worked by collating textual accounts, both ancient and modern. And I've always loved this, is this approach is something that Barrow dismisses as closet geography. So McQueen's stuck in the geographical closet, and therefore his claims aren't valid. And as I also discussed in the written paper, there is a story here which I'd be very happy to discuss in questions about the role of enslaved African knowledge in McQueen's account, but that's perhaps a different story. So this is a contested map. Secondly, this is a projection, and I use the word projection in the sense, in its sort of contemporary use then, in that McQueen was himself a projector. His interest in West Africa was thoroughly commercial and colonial rather than scientific. All the maps he had created since 1816 and the writings that accompanied them sought to make a particular argument about a scheme to exploit the commercial potential of the region and to win support for this scheme from potential investors in London, Liverpool and Glasgow, as well as from the British state. And the 1826 map is essentially an argument about just how valuable the Niger could be as a means of commercial intercourse with the African interior. And he also made arguments about the importance of these islands here in the Gulf of Guinea as kind of sites for British bases. Thirdly, the map made a particular economic argument. It was part of a wider articulation of McQueen's stance towards commerce, one based on protected markets, monopolistic trading companies, and the value of colonial rather than foreign trade. In other words, this is also a map about mercantilism, about a kind of a self-sustaining and sealed economic system. And fourthly, this was a political map. It made an argument against British policy as was at the time. Britain had settled at Sierra Leone in 1787, and McQueen doesn't even show Freetown or Sierra Leone. And there's an argument essentially that Britain is wasting its time here when it should be focused on this area here. Sierra Leone was thoroughly bound up with the abolitionist cause, and McQueen, who was a former manager of a West Indian slave plantation, a former owner of enslaved people, and someone who remained fundamentally involved in West Indian commerce, used this as an opportunity to kick the abolitionist campaign. So there is more going on to the map than maybe first apparent. Now, I'm not saying the Brontes were aware of of what's going on here, and I'm certainly not arguing that we can somehow trace this forward into what the Brontes will later do. But there are some claims I do think we can make. The first thing to say is that the Atlantic termination theory in Britain was most closely associated with McQueen and his publications. The geographical establishment didn't accept that the Niger did in fact flow into the Gulf of Guinea until after 1830, and the Brontes only had access to Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. Now, perhaps because I was at a conference a few days ago on counterfactual history, but it is worth reflecting on what this imaginary world of the Brontes would have looked like if they had a copy of the Quarterly Review. And indeed, very specific elements, this is Christine Alexander's redrawing of the map, very specific elements of McQueen's geography are in the Bronte imaginary Africa. So their vision of the Niger was truncated, but McQueen said that this essentially would be the ideal site for a British base, which is where they placed the capital, and he also placed, as I said before, great attention to the importance of the islands in this region. Secondly, the young Brontes appear to have shared McQueen's thoroughly colonialist vision. McQueen had no doubt about Britain's right to exploit West Africa commercially, nor how easy it would be. This despite the fact that Britain was engaged in a war with the Kingdom of Ashanti during this period, which had in fact resulted in the governor of Sierra Leone having his head removed and kept as an Ashanti war trophy, which was a deep trauma for the British imperial psyche. But McQueen argued repeatedly that a few Congreve rockets would keep the natives in line. And the Brontes seem that although the young men are always fighting the Ashanti, they're never an existential threat. They're just kind of in the background. And then thirdly, the young Brontes also appear to have shared McQueen's thoroughly secular vision. McQueen had no time for missionaries and believed that it was through commerce that civilization could be spread. And in fact, the kind of the way in which McQueen marginalizes Sierra Leone, as I said, is about that. And indeed, the young Bronte seem to have been far more skeptical of the whole evangelical enterprise than their father. And although before I said we shouldn't trace this into their adult literature, it is interesting that Jane Eyre chooses the Edward Rochester, the man with the West Indies in his blood and a West Indian skeleton in his closet, rather than St. John Rivers, who offers Jane Eyre a life as an Indian missionary, as a wife of an Indian missionary. In short, while I suppose the argument I'm making, while it is tempting to read this imaginary cartography as just a youthful reflection of a general idea about Africa, which is circulating in Western Europe at the time, and there is that, I would argue there's actually a much more specific Africa, there's a much more specific African imaginary that the Brontes are latching onto. In the written paper, I call it McQueenian. I think that's over-egging the pudding. I think this is a West Indian vision of Africa that the Brontes unknowingly are in a sense imbibing and playing with. So, a brief conclusion. Just over a decade after Bramwell made this map, and when the Niger problem had been solved once and for all, the British government organised an expedition of 3 steamships, travel up the River Niger in order to establish a commercial and agricultural presence in the interior. And this was at the behest of the African Civilization Society, which was led by the abolitionist Thomas Fowell Buxton. Now, this expedition, the Niger expedition, was as near to realising the imaginary world of the Brontes as anything that had come before. And the chief geographical expert who collaborated very closely with Buxton was, in fact, James McQueen. He produced this new map of Africa for this, and he also produced a series of naval charts, hydrological charts as well. The expedition was an utter disaster. There were many, many deaths and disease. The model farm that was established up the River Niger failed and was soon found to be using slavery-like forms of labour. And indeed, Buxton, the abolitionist leader, was publicly humiliated and essentially retired from the public, the utter disaster of all his plans. McQueen was able to leverage his involvement in this. He got elected Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, which was something he'd been trying for a long time and to keep being blackballed. And in one sense, we could say that the failure of the Niger expedition was what happens when an imaginary Africa clashes with, a real Africa. This just speaks to the fantasy that these people were trading in. But I've always thought that this vision of this expedition, and particularly its establishment effectively of a slave plantation right up the middle of the River Niger, was exactly the kind of thing that an old West Indian hand like McQueen was kind of dreaming about all along. Thank you.
Please do stay here, and do we have also our other speaker? Yes. We have questions. Martin.
Well, I don't need the microphone. So anyway, question for Jordana. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the riverine geography, because on so many of those maps, the Amazon, the Paraguay, the Paraná are greatly exaggerated in a way that other rivers are not. And they were pretty easily to navigate. Asuncion, Paraguay was founded quite early. And so just to add to the coastal, what is the riverine role? And even on the later map, and we do have Iguazu Falls as one interior place, so a little bit. And actually, I have a question for David, too. It might be a little bit off topic, so please excuse me. But I just wonder if you could talk about the extraordinary creativity of the Brontes. I know of a lot of very creative sibling pairs, but here we have 3 and perhaps 4 if you want to add. And they all died in their late 20s. I guess Charlotte made it to her late 30s. Do you think there's a role of having this shared imaginative universe in creating both a sibling bond and a profound, if troublesome, creativity?
Sure, I'll go first. So thank you for that question. I guess I'm not saying that the interior didn't matter at all and there was no understanding of it. I would push back on it was easy to navigate those rivers. It wasn't all that easy. They didn't always get to the end and come back. But the vision that when travelers were going, there aren't accounts that actually, the way you have accounts of the coast, show the people going down and back, tracking on the inland. There's La Condamine in the 18th century. There are maps of the rivers that are coming back. But this vision of taking a step back as a traveler, showing the whole space and putting themselves on the map and putting that travel around the map isn't coming back until the 19th and 20th centuries. And so the interior matters, and but the foreigners aren't allowed into it. And by the time the foreigners are allowed to go in and explore, they're looking for mines, they're not looking for rivers. And so there are going to be maps of interior journeys, but they come much later, and they don't grab into the imagination in the same way that these traveler accounts that commercialize through this kind of vision are going to go there and back. So,
But just quickly,
Yeah.
any idea then why those rivers are so wide, so much wider than any other river in the world on so many of these maps? Is that just an oddity? Is there anything to say about that?
there, I'm sure, is a lot to say about that. I would hesitate to take a
Yeah.
guess for you. If you look at the Hack Atlas, right, there are visions of this that go back to 16th century maps long before anybody had any knowledge of it, and those get copied and pasted until they figure things out. So in some ways it's the unknown, and it's the vision of potential riches and potential, rather than actual knowledge would be my guess. I'm looking at Chet, he's nodding, so I'm gonna stop there. He's not shaking his head no.
I mean, their output as children is extraordinary. I mean, they primarily on this worked in pairs, Bramwell and Charlotte, and then Anne and Emily went off, and in a sense, they were encouraged by the elder two to work within this world, but then they began to expand eastwards, and there's another kind of story they start to write. But they collaborated. I mean, the origins of these stories were partly in plays, which they put on together. And then they were just, I mean, you can see the material, some of the things they've produced, these tiny little sort of like newspapers with tiny handwriting. And so there's a story about there's collaboration, but there's also a story about competition, because the way the story gets taught about why they start to put some of these things down on paper and move away from the play form and start drawing these maps and things is when the father comes back from a trip with 12 soldiers, which is a present for Bramwell, and his three younger sisters each take one off him. They just say, right, we're having this one, and they name them, and they become the young boys. So in a sense, it's the same, because the girls get toys as well, but they want some of Bramwell's. So it's competition and collaboration, and I think Christine Alexander is right. I mean, it's extraordinary, this world that they create, and as I say, and it's constantly being remade, and it's a very surprising. It's a canvas they just work through, and they so much of their kind of some of the themes you see later appear in this.
Thank you. Thanks for some amazing talks. I have two questions. The first one is to David. I'll take you up on your offer to ask you about enslaved African knowledge in McQueen's account. And the next question is to both of you. Kind of irresponsible here, but both of you talked about delusion. And I would like to hear your thoughts on, here we are talking about the global imaginary and delusion. Are there implications or potential lessons for how we can understand persistent global inequality? You just mentioned you went to a historic conference on counterfactual history. Like, what can you say more about that? Are there lessons for us and this kind of imagining and delusions and consumption of some romantic literati?
Okay, well, let's do the easy bit. Well, Jordana has to think about how we're going to do the second bit. Briefly. Okay, so basically it's very straightforward. McQueen, his first interest in West African geography starts when he's managing a slave plantation in the island of Grenada, and he essentially discovers he has enslaved people on his plantation who have travelled, who have been taken on coffles and then sold to European slave traders. And from them, he is able to extract information about the kind of routes they'd taken along sort of, kind of point information. And from this, he starts to learn about the Niger and about the Senegambian region. And that becomes the original origin of his arguments for an Atlantic termination theory. So that's the kind of thing. There's other things going on, but that's the simple thing. Part two?
Part two. All right. I'll take a stab at that while you think about part two. So I'll point you back to this lovely map, and I think there are absolutely consequences. So this imaginary of Latin America is something to go around and export from as people live, settle, and go inland, is perhaps most visibly represented here, which is a map for cruise ships. So when you think about crews and North Americans cruising around South America, it's 1927. There's something notably missing on the map, and yet the ship magically seems to be sailing across the Panamanian Peninsula. That is the Panama Canal, and the expression of American imperialism and power in the early 20th century is silenced by this vision of pirates and going around and converting history into something that becomes entertainment. That this vision is so familiar and so comfortable, and that vision of European exploration empowerment allows, with El Dorado still happily where rivers ought to run, the Amazons. So I think there's indeed a lesson to be learned, which is we get comfortable with these views and we don't question them, and we replicate them even when doing research to get them back on the map. And that, I think, can be questioned and analyzed. Do I have a solution to that problem? I would say reading forward at the best possible sense, and sometimes the temptation to pull a contemporary knowledge and put it back onto the period when somebody is making something is often what gets us into trouble, because we know where the story ends, they don't. And so trying to know what they know and when they knew it and stopping there sometimes allows us to sort of experience that ambiguity in a way that doesn't lead to simple answers.
Okay, very, very briefly. One of the things, it wasn't a history conference, it was actually all kind of people involved in sustainability. It was really interesting. Very briefly, one of the things they were doing is trying to imagine a world where we had peak oil in 1973, and how would we now be dealing with a situation where we've had peak oil? And the reason they're doing that is to try and understand how our world might deal when that happens to us. So in essential, what they were trying to do is think, how do we deal with a radically changing energy situation, or the political consequences of that, and using counterfactual thought to kind of play around with that in order to produce a just and sustainable world. But maybe I'll talk to you more about it, because it was very interesting.
Thanks. Back to South America for a moment, and thank you. I would have loved to have wallowed in your image. It's really interesting. Love West Africa, but I have a question about South America. Was there a particular reason you exclude the Spanish colonial visits and official accounts, including maps of the interior in all over the possessions? Thank you.
The short answer is yes. I'm looking at things that were published and diffused. So Juan and Ulloa, who in the late 18th century or in the mid 18th century were publishing accounts that were approved by the Spanish crown and diffused through print, absolutely. The Spanish were mapping their own world, but that didn't become part of Europe's visual vocabulary, because that was hidden material, that was manuscript material, and most of the Spanish cartography of the colonial period was not put into print. Some of it that was, there are other examples, but they come fairly late. Thinking of Chapteau Terroche, who went to Mexico in the late 18th century to observe the transit of Venus. He dies en route, but he picks up a map of Mexico City, and that is published in his account. And so the Mexican map makes it into print. But it's fairly late in the period, and the Spanish in the early years, or after Columbus gets out, are pulling back, especially the route maps. They don't like the pirates. They would prefer not to be attacked and have their gold taken.
Two very quick questions. In South America, is it possible that the aversion to inside exploration could have been due to the weather? And insects and animals and things like that?
There was interior exploration. It's not by the folks who wrote the travel accounts that were published. So you can read those accounts now as they've been translated and published in the 19th and 20th centuries, but at the time, few of them were in print and they rarely had maps. If you want to read an early 20th century account, Theodore Roosevelt's travel up a river to map a river, a river route into Brazil in the early 20th century where he almost died.
Right.
You can have that very tactile experience about just how tough it was to go inland in Brazil and try and survive without stages and supplies and potential things. It was hard work. Travel, it comes by its name for good reason. So again, I'm not saying, and I'm sorry if I gave this, I'm not saying that no one went there and there was no exploration.
Yeah.
I'm saying the visuals that Europeans got about Spanish America before the early 1900s was really that view from a ship. And that view from a ship has been so well engraved in our memories that we just assume that it's okay. And so airlines are doing it, cruise ships are doing it. Even when people can go in, they often don't.
Okay. And my other quick. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to follow up in the sense, because I wasn't sure where your cutoff point was, but if you're talking about early 20th century, and yes, of course, all the travel, got it. But hugely impactful in Europe, of course, in the early 19th century is Humboldt's work. And highly visual, in fact, really quite innovative in all of that. Not just mapping, but also visualizing the interior,
Yes.
right, and the accounts.
Absolutely.
So you chose not to touch on Humboldt.
Yes.
I forgot about him. My other quick question on the Africa Association was that I'm thinking of guys like Gibbons and a few other names, but was it a liberal-leaning association?
No, it was very, very mixed. If you look who the members were, they were all over the shop, both sides of politics. There were also people who were on one side of politics in favor and against the abolition of the slave trade. So it was a real mixed bag of people. Famously, when Mungo Park comes back and his account is edited, it's edited by the West Indian slaveholder Brian Edwards, and you get this really curious account where you have a map and a geographical essay produced by James Rennell coming from one perspective, and you've got this account which was Brian Edwards was accused essentially of suppressing what Mungo Park had to say against slavery. So really complicated and contested organization, and no, politically they were very wide-ranging.
We have time for one last question, a brief question, a brief answer.
Okay. Well, it's a conceptual question. I love both the papers, so I'll have to wait on David's question since I'm allowed only one. So this theory about the God's eye view. So what would you be able to puncture that theory with your notion of the ship's eye view?
Can I think on that and get back to you over coffee? And if you want to ask David a question since I'm
I was
punting.
curious about Sierra Leone. I was, because Wellington Land is in Sierra Leone, right? In the Bronte imagination?
No.
I thought in the map that we saw.
Yeah, well, they put it there. But if you notice, I should have drawn attention to this. Yeah. When they, when the original settlement is the Glasstown Federation, and you've got Vidopolis on the coast, the Niger Delta, effectively, and as you go up the coast, the next settlement is Freetown. So what the Brontes have actually done is they've picked Freetown up from Sierra Leone and plonked on the Niger, just as James McQueen said they should have done.
On that note, I would like to I would like to thank you, our two speakers, for two very stimulating papers.